everybody, and welcome to our fourth forum, which theme is Mind the Gaps, Improving Global Governance in Times of COVID-19. Our specific session today is about Beyond Stop and Go, how to restore global mobility. This is indeed a key challenge because with the sudden eruption of this pandemic, all travel was brought to an abrupt stop, both within and between countries, at a time when freedom of move is considered as a basic human right. Impact has been huge, be it at personal, social, or economic levels. It is currently assessed that the global economy could lose over $4 trillion due to the impact on tourism only, and this also means thousands of jobs lost. Now, travel restrictions have been mostly imposed in an uncoordinated way, with diverse and constantly varying rules, adding to confusion, difficulties, frustrations. No global governance at all here indeed. Things are slowly getting back to normal, but not at the same pace and not everywhere. Plus, to be frank, today we can't exclude going back to restrictions because figures are rising again, even in vaccinated countries. And then we have a continent like Africa, where only 6% of the population is vaccinated. So here we have 3 points. Virtual exchanges are great, we can see that here, but they cannot fully replace physical contacts. Plus, not everybody is able to switch to those given the current digital divide. The current situation means that indeed there is a growing gap between those who can access virtual mobility and those who can't, between those who can travel and those who can't, with a growing divergence between rules governing travel. And last but not least, I would say that we are not dealing here with a one-shot challenge. COVID is far from ended. We all know there will be further pandemics. And in fact, limiting travel of people is already considered as being the best way to prevent spreading new viruses. So does that mean that we need to consider that globetrotting is coming to an end? So this discussion with our panelists will be key. First, to understand the impact, current and expected, on physical mobility. Second, to assess the challenges. And third, maybe to share best practices and to allow for a better coordinated governance of the new rules that would at least make them more acceptable to the people. So gathered here, we have, or I think we're waiting for, Prime Minister of Albania, Edi Rama. We have Willie Walsh, who is Director General of the International Air Transport Association. Henry Wong, who is founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. And Alan Sophia Asimwe, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Trademark East Africa. I'm sorry because I don't see the panelists for the time being. I don't know whether Prime Minister Edi Rama has arrived. Can you hear me, Prime Minister? Prime Minister? No, I don't see the Prime Minister. I'm sorry, so we are waiting for him. So let's go to Dr. Henry Wong. Good afternoon or good morning, Dr. Henry Wong. Dr. Henry Wong, you are the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. You are also an advisor to the Chinese government and a thought leader on globalization, global governance, global trade. You graduated from various universities across the world and you have participated to various high-level events over the planet. So you obviously qualify as a global citizen and a globetrotter. To what extent for you has this new COVID-restricted world changed your way of living and of working? Which recommendations would you make to make it work, both for people and business? Thank you.
Thank you, Moderator. Yeah, I hope you can hear me clear. I think that the COVID-19 has really impacted our world dramatically and has slowed down the travel and international exchanges. I think it's high time that we do something together. I think probably one thing we could do is that we should really use in the digital technology, that we should first intensify the vaccine application to the majority of people as we can. And secondly, we should get this acid test and also the green barcode for applications for all the people we have, and then we should really have a very good way of tracing and identifying people who actually has the virus, and then we can really put them into quarantine. So, but I think in general we should really open up economy and traffic and exchanges among the countries. I think now we see that U.S. and Japan and Singapore and many other countries has lifted their travel restrictions and opened to people who have vaccine and have got the test before they can come. So hope that we can reach a equal, a balance point where we maintain the control of the virus, but at the same time we can maximize the mobility of the people. I think that is really important that we can do. I think here in China, what we can see is that the virus is very few. We have only a few dozen cases throughout the country, a few hundreds maybe altogether. So how we can maintain that? We're having Winter Olympic coming up, a lot of athletes coming to China. So we hope that China can also find a way to accommodate the international travel, but also at the same time contain the virus, and other countries. So we should have a summit of international travel conducted by UN or international travel aviation organizations, that we can really let the government to facilitate the travel. I think this is really urgent and very important now.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Wong. I mean, indeed, coordinating or better coordination of all these travel rules are indeed absolutely key. Maybe there are still two challenges to overcome, because this would help certainly, but it means that people are vaccinated, which is obviously not the case all over the world. And second, that people have access to digital tools, but we'll cross that bridge later. But if you have any recommendation to do on that stage, that would be very useful. Maybe let me come now. I don't think that Prime Minister Rama has rejoined. So shall I come to Mr. Walsh? Mr. Walsh, you're here. I don't see you. I saw you, but I don't see you anymore. Mr. Walsh, last April, you've been appointed director. Oh yes, Prime Minister. Do you mind, Mr. Walsh, if I go to Prime Minister first? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Prime Minister, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, vous dirigez un...
Prime Minister, no. In Albania, tourism is an essential resource. You have the landscape, the mountains, the coasts, and all the areas of the country. The interpreter apologizes, but there is a problem with the voice coming through.
Prime Minister. Prime Minister, do you hear me? Prime Minister? Okay. Prime Minister, do you hear me? Okay, so maybe if we can check, one, if the Prime Minister is hearing us correctly, and two, whether he's happy for us to speak English, okay? Thank you very much. Meanwhile, I will come back, sorry about that, to Mr. Walsh. So, Mr. Walsh, last April, you have been appointed Director General for the International Air Transport Association. If I'm well informed, this association currently gathers around 290 airlines, primarily major carriers, representing more than 100 countries. It supports airline activity and helps formulate industry policy and standards. Prior to that, you were for 10 years the chief executive of IAG, which is the parent company of British Airways and Albania. And indeed, I understand that you delayed your retirement due in March 2020 to help the airline to trade through the outbreak of COVID. So no one better than you can tell us what the eruption of COVID practically meant and still means for any airline. What are the challenges and difficulties? But now you can also tell us about the challenges and hopes of creating a coordinated system of travel rules and required documents. And maybe here you can tell us a bit more about this IATA Travel Pass project, which seems very promising indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I think the difficulties we're experiencing with the connectivity to the Prime Minister demonstrates that while this technology is good, it doesn't in any way replace the value of meeting face-to-face. It's no secret that the COVID-19 pandemic has devastated the airline industry. Globally, last year, airlines lost $138 billion US. And this year, we're forecasting that losses will reduce to about $52 billion US, the second highest loss in the history of the industry. Next year should be better, with losses still in the industry, but reducing to about 12 billion. So cumulative losses of over $200 billion US since this pandemic started. The good news is I think we're past the worst point. And indeed, if we look at figures for the air cargo industry, it's now 9% above where it was pre-pandemic. And air cargo provided a crucial lifeline to many. It was critical in the delivery of essential PPE and medical supplies, and more recently in the distribution of life-saving vaccines. And where governments have not introduced or have removed restrictions on passenger traffic, we see the recovery being very swift. This year, we expect domestic markets, which typically account for about just under 40% of all flying, that they will recover to about 75% of where they were pre-pandemic. But international travel, where many restrictions continue to be in place, will lag significantly and only reach about 22% of the levels we saw in 2019. And indeed, to the end of September, we were at less than 20%. Next year, we expect domestic markets to have fully recovered. But with ongoing restrictions on international travel, the passenger market there will lag at about 44% of 2019 figures. But we are moving in the right direction. The problem, however, as we reopen and rebuild international connectivity, is that we face the challenge of a myriad of complex travel health requirements. Paper-based solutions will overburden check-in at airports and immigration queues. Indeed, in many places, we don't have the people or the space at airports to check every individual passenger if that verification has to be done using paper methods. And this is where the IATA Travel Pass is essential. We developed this technology to provide a digital solution to airlines and to enable them to process passenger data in relation to these health requirements before the customer gets to the airport. And indeed, this facility will also be available to governments to ease the processing at immigration. And we have had very successful dialogue with governments around the world, particularly here in the Middle East, where I'm joining you today, with governments recognizing that a digital solution will be critical as passenger numbers start to rebuild. The vision that IATA has for the future as we rebuild and re-establish connectivity aligns very closely with the recent ministerial declaration from ICAO. In simple terms, we believe vaccines should be available to everybody who needs one. That people who are vaccinated should be able to travel without restriction. And that those who can't be vaccinated or have an access to vaccines should be able to travel if sensible testing regimes are put in place. And finally, we believe that rapid antigen testing should be used instead of expensive and complex PCR testing. The data is quite clear that in terms of managing risk, these tests are just as good as the PCR tests. And finally, just to comment on the closure of borders. It's clearly of no value when countries close their borders after the virus is in their country. And I think there's no greater evidence of this than data from the UK, where all people arriving in the UK since the 25th of February of this year have been required to undertake a PCR test after they arrive. Up to the end of September, 9 million PCR tests were administered to people arriving in the UK. The positivity rate of those people was less than 1%, 0.8%, while at the same time, during the same period, the positivity rate in the general population was 7.2%. So clearly the risk is not from people flying into the country, the risk is actually in the country. And closing your borders or maintaining your borders closed is adding little, if any, benefit to managing the health crisis associated with the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Walsh, for all this. And indeed, when you say that people who are vaccinated should be allowed, fully vaccinated, should be allowed to travel, and if not, they should be allowed to travel with a PCR test or at least a lateral flow test. How hopeful are you that this can be accepted on a wide stage, I mean, by several different countries? I mean, is this conversation you're having? Do you think this will happen? What's your...
Yes, certainly we're more optimistic, and indeed we are seeing many countries now recognize that people who have been fully vaccinated should be able to travel without restriction or the need for additional tests. And clearly we can't tolerate a world where only those who have been vaccinated can travel. It would be grossly unfair to many people around the world who cannot access vaccines if they're not able to travel. And that's why we believe where vaccines aren't available, that people should be able to travel with sensible risk-based testing regimes in place. But I am more hopeful, and we are certainly seeing more and more governments look to coordinate their activities to mutually recognize the systems that they have been put in place. And indeed, a very positive recent development is that over 50 countries have now adopted the EU Digital COVID Certificate, the EU DCC, which the EU has made available free of charge to countries who would like to use the technology that they have developed.
No, I think this is very hopeful. And indeed, once again, if we are thinking about our key topic, which is minding the gaps, we must make all that's possible to avoid adding the handicap of not being vaccinated to the handicap of not being able to travel, especially if you don't have access to digital tools. So it's certainly something that we must keep in mind. Thank you very much, Mr. Walsh, for all this. Mr. Prime Minister, do you hear me? And can I speak English? Is that okay for you? Or vous préférez le français?
Would you prefer me to speak French? The Prime Minister's microphone is not coming through to the interpreter. Prime Minister, thank you for being with us. You are in charge of a wonderful country. It has many resources, a beautiful landscape. You have coastal areas, mountains, and so on. The sound from the moderator is intermittent. Now, people can go into your country without PCR tests and without... Is this true? Is the moderator listening to the interpretation? Because we are getting feedback. Can you please turn off the speakers? Because there's a sound loop which is being formed. Thank you.
Is it still the case, Mr. Est-ce que c'est toujours le cas, Monsieur le Premier ministre? Est-ce qu'on peut toujours...
Is it true that people can go to Albania
without
a
tests?
test? A COVID test. The sound level is very poor and the interpreter cannot follow what the moderator is speaking.
The interpreter says the question is cut out, I'm afraid.
There's feedback coming through the moderator's computer. We need to turn off the speakers on the computer.
Okay, I wonder whether the best way to do it, I don't know whether the interpreter is hearing me, is I will do both. I will ask the question in French and then in English. So, Monsieur le Premier ministre, je recommence. Votre pays est un pays magnifique.
Albania is a magnificent country. I would like to know how did you go about beating COVID? That's what we would like to know. Because you did it without any confinement or people being forbidden to travel. Did you do it like that?
Voilà. Quelle est votre recette et sans aucun impact sur...
What is your recipe and what impact has it had on your activities?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
We don't hear the I don't know who is following and who can help on that. Monsieur le Premier Ministre.
Mr. Prime Minister, I'm really sorry about the situation. We cannot hear you. I would like to know whether you can hear me. Can you hear us? That's what we would like to know already. If somebody can indeed check the situation. Meanwhile, I will maybe move on. No sound, I'm afraid, says the interpreter.
Okay. Okay, so let's keep for the time being to Ms. Asimwe, and apologies again for these hiccups, which, as Mr. Walsh just mentioned, indeed prove that digital world can't replace physical world. So, Ms. Asimwe, you are the Chief Technology Officer of Trademark East Africa, which was established in 2010 and contributed to substantial gains in East Africa's trade and regional integration in terms of reduced cargo transit times, improved border efficiency, and reduced barriers to trade. Can you please maybe tell us first to what extent COVID impact has affected East Africa's trade, and then what can be practically done to lessen that impact and ease lives for people and businesses? Maybe you can tell us a bit more about the new Safe Trade Emergency Facility you have created, and also maybe tell us how does that work with other African regions, or is it just confined, if I may say so, to East Africa region? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Indeed, as Mr. Walsh said, digital can never replace the personal touch and connection. East Africa, like all other regions, has been severely impacted by COVID. In the first few weeks and months of COVID, we saw borders closed, we saw lockdowns at country level, and of course, we saw communities that thrive on trade, especially cross-border traders, mostly women, impacted so severely. We saw them lose all their income. I think 96% of savings, total cash out of incomes, people were actually starving, people were doing anything to cross the borders. So we saw loss of lives as people tried to access the borders. We were affected at a personal level. We saw supply chains severely and drastically impacted. And as you know, we trade mostly in agricultural products. So you had lots of fruits, vegetables, fresh foods rotting at borders. We as Trademark, East Africa quickly swung into action to create a program with the governments called Safe Trade. We work in 12 countries in East Africa, Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somaliland, and in the south, Mozambique, Malawi, and Zambia. And in the first phase, we immediately came up with the PPE for border officials, because you do recognize border officials and officials at the ports were actually passing away from COVID, because most of the focus was in the capital cities. Most of the focus was at the airport, and less focus was at the borders and at the ports. And as we know, we quickly learned that long distance drivers were conduits for COVID. Much as in the 80s and 90s, we saw them really as a conduit and vectors for HIV/AIDS. We saw the same scenario playing out again with COVID, unfortunately. So borders immediately closed down. Governments closed down borders because they were trying to stop the flow of COVID. But as Willie has said, Mr. Walsh has said, it's so interesting when you try to close the border when the virus is already inside the border. It doesn't make much sense. So what we quickly realized was what governments and citizens wanted was the trust that there's a system that can work, that there's trust in that certificates that are obtained, that people are not going to forge certificates, that if someone shares a COVID test certificate, it is genuine. So we worked with the governments to create an app, a GPS-enabled app, so again, digital solutions came in, that focused on tracking truck drivers across the transport corridors. And when I talk about transport corridors, these are routes traversing many countries, and they're allowing the free movement of goods, especially food, medicine, PPE, and even factory inputs, because factories had to continue producing as companies pivoted to produce, for instance, masks or sanitizer. And so in the last year, we have registered over 123,000 truck drivers on this app. They are tracked. It has restored the trust among the citizens and trust among the governments that they can leave their borders open. Unfortunately, this is not the same case in Southern Africa and in West Africa, where borders remain closed because they do not have these digital solutions. So we are trying to see how we can extend some of these solutions to other parts of Africa. At a personal level, and Mr. Walsh has talked about it, we've seen communities excluded, of course, from some of these solutions. We have seen communities excluded because of COVID. Cross-border traders were unable to trade for a long time because the borders were closed. Even when they opened borders to trucks and goods, movement of goods, people could not move. So women's livelihoods and communities were totally destroyed. So what we've been working on with governments is something called safe trade zones. Zones where we create markets that are safe, where the protocols can be utilized for them to wash hands, to keep a safe distance, so that they're able to continue trading. We are establishing at the borders of Uganda and Kenya, and at the borders with Somaliland. We are trying to put as many as possible to allow trade to continue, because our livelihoods depend on trade. So this is the situation in East Africa and in Africa as a whole. What we are now moving to is vaccination. Mr. Wong spoke about vaccination and the gap Africa faces. Only 6%, I think, in Africa is vaccinated. You mentioned Natalie. It's totally unacceptable, because given that vaccinations and tests are the guides for travel, you find that many of our people are unable to travel. So what we are trying to work on is a common pass with the East African Committee, akin to the EAC Green Pass, and actually we are rather EU Green Pass, and we are working with the EU to try and see how we can roll this out with the East African community. So there are lots of solutions that are possible, but we must ensure that we do not leave people out. If I speak for myself, I have had to take over 50 to 60 tests in the last few weeks as I travel to do my work across the region. I recently traveled to West Africa. I had to do no less than 4 tests for one trip, and that is simply not acceptable. It's expensive. It is harmful to our health, I believe. And so we need to continue exploring ways that do not deter trade. And like Mr. Walsh talked about, mutual recognition and cheaper ways of testing. So I think let me stop there, but there's so much more we need to do to increase trust in our region.
No, thank you very much for this. And in fact, this is a question both for you and Mr. Walsh. I mean, who should be in the driving seat to make sure that we achieve these coordinated rules? I mean, who is the best place to do that? I mean, should it be a bottom-up approach, a country-to-country or regional approach that then can be leveraged at a larger level? I mean, what's your take on this, both of you who are practitioners on the ground, and we see how it works? And of course, Mr. Wong, if you have a recommendation here, that would be welcome. So shall we begin by Mr. Wong? Do you have a recommendation on that? I don't think he has. We don't hear you, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I think I have a few recommendations, of course, to recommend. I think first we could really have the international, travel, airline, hotel industry. We should have all the business all come together, find a way to facilitate, for example, the airline industry, how we can, Mr. Wells just said, how can we find a better way to cope, shorten test and fully vaccine, and also facilitate the travel and increase the frequency of the travel. Second, I think most important is that the government should really get together. We should have an international vaccine summit, or really to allocate the vaccine to poor developing countries, so that we can cut the deficit of the vaccine. Can be evenly applied to the world population, so we can really start this trouble with safety on that. And thirdly, I think that in international organizations like UN, WHO, G20 should really focus on how we can lift the travel ban by different countries, and how we can facilitate that. That's really important. I think that particularly student travel, for example, we can see the student travel is now also come at a very minimum now. We need to encourage more student travel. Fourth recommendation I have is that we should really learn from each other. For example, how we can maintain the lowest minimum occurrence of the COVID cases. For example, in China, they've been doing that quite well. They have a quarantine, they have a massive testing, they have also social distance, digital communications technology, the green passcode, and on your mobile phone, things like that, and then also the community support for comeback to COVID-19. So I think those countries who have the best local governance example should be really exchanged with other countries, so we can minimize the occurrence of the COVID-19. So I think if we combine all those together, that we are able to really achieve this equilibrium. Where is the maximum point that we compromise at the minimum risk, but also maximizing the travel, mobility, and also activities between the countries. Because I think it's really important that we have to really lift the travel and exchanges. We cannot continue to be isolated. We already done that for almost 2 years now. We need to really revive that. But also we need to avoid casualties. We need to avoid the big number of jumping up of all these high affected cases. We have to really lower down that. So I think it's a combination of all efforts. I think international organizations, leading countries like US, EU, China, Japan and others should really work together. International industry, like aviation industry, aviation organizations should really be giving more proposals. So I think Paris Peace Forum is really great to talk about this subject, and also we have these concrete project proposals on the table, really even to continue this dialogue and discussion to find a solution for the problem.
Very much, Dr. Wong. Mr. Walsh, what do you think of that? What's your take on this? We don't hear you.
I would agree with a lot of what Dr. Wong has said. I think we have bodies that could coordinate this activity. The disappointing thing for me is that very early on in this pandemic, countries went their own way. We lost coordination very quickly, which is disappointing considering this is a global pandemic. The challenge is the same for every country. The risk is the same for every country. You could possibly argue that the initial stages of this, when the fear was that health systems would be overrun, maybe the risk was different for countries. But once better knowledge and scientific evidence was available, we were facing a similar risk, and you would expect the world to have come together to try and reach solutions that would benefit everybody. We do have UN bodies that I think could have been more influential. I think they did a lot of good things, like the WHO. From an aviation point of view, the International Civil Aviation Organization, another UN body. And we've had G20 meetings where a lot of good comments, discussion has taken place, a lot of strong recommendations have been made. What has been disappointing, however, is that very few of these recommendations have translated into action. And really, that's what the world needs now. We need action. We need coordination. We need governments to work together. There needs to be greater mutual respect, trust, and recognition of the measures that have taken place. As Dr. Wong has said, I think we should be prepared to learn from one another, recognize where mistakes have been made that can be corrected by benefiting from lessons in other countries. But the critical issue is that we're going to have to learn to live with this virus in the same way as we've learned to live with other viruses. And we really do need to prepare ourselves for future pandemics, because I don't think, I'm not a scientist, but everything I've read and heard suggests that this will not be the last virus we have to deal with. So it would be a shame if the world does not learn a lot of valuable lessons from how we have handled this pandemic. Without question, I think we could have done an awful lot better by coordinating activities and by supporting one another, rather than individual countries believing that they knew what was right and knew what was best and going on their own isolated way. But I am optimistic, and as I said in my opening remarks, from an airline point of view, we are now witnessing greater cooperation and more countries coming together to mutually recognize their standards, to accept the WHO emergency list of vaccines that should be acceptable, and greater sharing of vaccines through the COVAX scheme, which I think needs to be enhanced so that poorer countries have access to life-saving vaccines that in many cases are going to waste in other countries.
No, absolutely. I mean, all these are key. I mean, even the fact that AstraZeneca vaccine coming through COVAX, but produced by Serum of India, were not recognized to go back into Europe. I mean, it's not understandable. It's not understandable. Thank you very much for this. Mrs. Imri, do you wish to add something to that? Where did we lose you? Well, waiting for you to come back because I think we are nearing the end of our time. I mean, what I take from, and thank you again for this great discussion, is digital world can't replace physical travel. I think we've come to an end of the possibilities of these virtual meetings. I mean, this can't go on indefinitely. The second point is, as you all said, we are experimenting shared challenge, and shared challenges call for shared solutions. Otherwise, it will be inefficient. So we must certainly increase the coordination and find the ways, be it a multilateral, institutional way, to share best practices, but also, as you said, what didn't work, and to try to understand what, why, and don't let us do it again. Because as you said, one, COVID is not ended, there are variants everywhere, and two, we are on for future pandemics. So this is something that will be inescapable. And third, I'm still coming back to that. Some of the best practice you have talked about, they are digital. So I'm still slightly concerned about how are we going to do it for people who don't have access to digital. And there are still a lot of them in the world. I don't know whether Miss Asimwe has been able to come back. I don't see her on the screen. If one of you, Dr. Wong or Mr. Walsh, you want to add a last word before we close our session?
Just to reinforce what you've said, digital technology is great and has certainly enhanced many parts of our life, but I don't think you can get away from the value of face-to-face interaction. The quality of debate is much better when we can get together. Quality of innovation is significantly greater when people can meet and discuss. We have to recognize that digital solutions have helped us, but it's not the only way forward. And I fully agree with you. While many countries have a dependence on digital solutions and indeed have benefited from them, there are still significant parts of the world where those opportunities are not available. But this pandemic should teach us that the world is a small place, and the more we can work together to help one another, I think the better for everybody.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walsh. Dr. Wong, do you want to add something?
Yes. No, I think absolutely. You know, we are living in a really dependent world now. And, you know, the world is actually in recession. And also the world is in much more geopolitical tension because of this isolation, because we cannot see each other, because we cannot talk to each other, and people-to-people exchanges has been stopped. You know, for example, every year China used to have 150 million people travel outside the mainland of China to outside China and mainland to many places. And the world tourism is a huge difficulty now. I see now that U.S. and Japan and other countries are really trying to revive this tourism industry. That we hope that international airline industry, international aviation organization of UN, and also you know, leading countries like the U.S., China, EU should really work together and find an international vaccine passport, international you know, green travel code, or international travel you know, quarantine scheme of some kind, and international student exchanges revival, international tourism revival, and international industry of travel industry related conference. We really need everybody's wisdom to really reach this kind of balancing point that we maintain, you know, we live with the virus, but also at the same time we open up the economy, but minimize the casualties of the COVID-19. So that's really the thing we have to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wong. Ms. Asimwe, I see that you've come back, and I'm sorry, but we lost you at some point. Do you want to add anything before we close the session? I'm sorry for missing you at some point.
Thank you so much. That's the story of our lives. The connectivity and bandwidth in Africa, of course, remains low. And so we find that we are often dropping off calls and disconnected from the world. So that's the reality we face. And we've talked about exclusion, we've talked about being left behind, and we're now seeing even with the global supply chains challenges, Africa is going to be a huge casualty of those. And it's not just for consumables in terms of high consumable needs that either it's our livelihoods, food, equipment, and medicines that are imported. Now, in terms of how we move forward, we're really trying to see how do we rebuild trust. How do we get countries, especially within countries, you find ministries of health have taken over and they're not working as closely with others. So you have a lot of knee-jerk reactions. So for instance, in my own country, in Uganda, you had overnight, there was an order to test everyone coming in. And so you had people waiting at the airport for 5 hours or something like that. Now that has been removed, but you find governments are coming up with knee-jerk reactions of not speaking with other agencies and not speaking with their neighbors. So I think we're going to try and push more for coordination within countries, coordination across borders and across the region. That's why the EU pass is a critical one for us, because if we can loop into this global pass, it enables us to continue that connection to the world and to allow Africa to reopen and trade. We're still so far behind in vaccine uptake and accessibility. There has been improvement in accessibility, but uptake is low. Let us not remain behind in reopening. Let us not be left behind by the world. So whatever we must do to get Africa and our regions connected, again, let's do it. And I think the magic lies in the North actually putting aside the vast resources that are needed for the South to be able to take this up, be it in vaccine manufacture on the continent, be it in policies, supporting the harmonization and mutual recognition of policies. Digital solutions are not cheap. They are much cheaper than physical, but they are not cheap. We have seen with the application on driver tracking, having to extend it across various countries is likely to cost quite a lot. So there's a lot of support needed to allow people to trust. In West Africa, it's even the basics, just getting border officials to appreciate the need to have borders open and to avoid the knee-jerk reaction to close. As Mr. Walsh said, closing once the virus is already in really doesn't make any sense. And we are seeing more variants coming. We are seeing more pandemics likely to happen. So the most important thing is not to be reactive, but to look at what kind of solutions we can put in place together. The futility of governments thinking they can close the virus out or close other pandemics out has really been shown in the last few months. So yeah, better coordination with governments leading, but of course with the private sector and citizens as well playing a role.
Thank you very much for this last word. So I think we can conclude now by saying that if anything, this COVID crisis has underlined and underscored how important global governance is, and how once again we're all living on this very small planet, as you said, Mr. Walsh. So let's work together to restore that freedom of mobility, which is really, once again, a basic human right. Thank you very much, all of you. Apologies for the slight technical hiccups, and thank you again for your participation. Goodbye.